Hi, I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and today I'm super excited to be doing the Butano Button Up sew along with you. This shirt I'm wearing is actually, this shirt will be sewing in the sew along. So I made my Butano out of a cotton tencel chambray fabric. It's really lovely to sew with. I wanted a chambray top because they're such a wardrobe essential. It's something that I know will match a lot of the stuff I already have in my wardrobe, and it's just gonna be this like great styling piece for spring and summer, and then also into fall because it has sleeves. We're gonna go step by step through the sewing process of the Butano, and I will be giving you tips and tricks along the way. If this is your first time sewing a button-up shirt, give me like a woohoo in the comments, because I really hope that this pattern, even though it does have more intermediate aspects, can inspire some people who are wanting to level up their sewing skills to try something that might seem like a stretch for where they're at. I feel confident that anyone can achieve this pattern if they just take it step by step. So yeah, let's get started. We'll get started with the prep. So the first prep step is to snip in at all notches. Notches are these little lines on your pattern. They are reference points or matching points, and we just want to make little snips at each of them. So just snipping in about 1/4 of an inch, and then you'll be able to see that reference point on your fabric when you're sewing. So I'm just gonna do that, and you'll repeat that for all of your pieces. Most of them have some sort of notch on them. Okay, the next prep step is stay stitching, which is a tedious but important step. And what it is on the curves of our front A, our back B, and our back yoke C, we're going to add a long straight stitch. And this protects the edges from stretching and growing during the sewing process. So I lengthened my stitch on my machine to about 3.5 millimeters, and then you sew 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch from the edge of your fabric going around the neckline and also going around the arm size. I've done it for my front. I need to do it here on my back on both pieces, and then I need to do it across the neckline and then also across these arm size on my back yoke piece. Okay, so here I have everything stay stitched. Now we're gonna fuse our interfacing on. So I've got my front A pieces, right sides facing down. So this is wrong side facing up, sorry. Interfacing piece 1 gets fused in place on the center fronts on the wrong side of our fabric. So the wrong side of your interfacing is the gluey side. That goes gluey side down, and you have a nice straight edge to match that up with. You'll also match notches on your interfacing with your front. Once your interfacing is in place, you'll just take a steamy iron and give it a good steam, and it'll fuse on. You're gonna fuse interfacing onto 1/2 of sleeve cuff K. You'll notice you have one notch up here, and this is the side that the interfacing gets fused onto. I have my sleeve interfacing piece 2 here. Glue side down, fuse it in place. Next up, we've got our collar stand. So we have 2 collar stands, but only one of them gets interfaced. The interfaced one is gonna be facing out. So if you are making, like say you were making a contrasting for the under collar stand, you might want to, you're using different fabric, put interfacing on the one that you want facing outward. And finally, our collar E. Same deal, the interfaced one is gonna face outward, so if you have a preference, put the interfacing on that one. And that's all the interfacing for right now. Now we have a ton of marking to do. So I have here my front A, and the first thing we're gonna mark is our darts. Those go on the wrong side of the fabric. So I've got my paper scissors here, and I'm just gonna cut up one dart leg to the point. Then you can just fold this back on that other dart leg, and that will give you your dart opening that you can trace onto the wrong side. So I'm aligning my pattern piece, and then I will just trace it. I'm using chalk. You can use any sort of removable marking tool. Ta-da. You'll repeat that on both sides. There she is. We're also marking on the front, the right side of our front pieces. In the design, the Butano has one front pocket, so I'm going to put that on this side, which would be the wearer's where is right. Just mark this line. So I'm gonna fold the pattern back at that line. There's my pocket placement. We want to mark these button placements on the right side. So again, I think the easiest way to do this is to fold back so that I can still see half of the X. And we'll use this mark at the end, so make sure that you're marking with something that isn't just going to come right out. Water soluble, or they go away when you press, and we don't want to lose these marks. I'm going to use a pen, but it's okay because I know that my buttons / buttonholes are going to go on top of this. And I'm just going to give myself little dots, which I'm not sure if you'll be able to see these on camera. Right there. I'm only going to mark one side because I'm going to use my first set, like if I were doing buttonholes, I would do my buttonholes and then sew my buttons on based on my buttonholes, not the markings, because things can shift even like 1/8 of an inch, and at that point you'll wish you hadn't marked your pattern piece. So that is the marks that we need on our front A. So I'm going to set these pieces aside. Is our back B. We need to mark this pleat stitching line on the right side of our pattern piece. So I'm just gonna make sure this is aligned, and then I'm gonna fold back at this line. I can see it, I don't know if you can. Probably not on the camera. I'm just drawing the line, and then I'm drawing a little cap so that I know where to end it. I'll need one of these on the other side as well, so I'm just gonna flip this over. There we go. So now I have those two lines. Okay, now we're going to work on our collar stand. So you have a collar stand stitching line guide in your pattern. And this is a nifty little tool that I created. So you're going to cut out this little, it's like a jig to show you your stitching line. So cut this piece out. And the way that it aligns is, if you line this dashed line up with this notch, you have a perfect line to trace right here. That's 3/8 of an inch from the edge. Having this curved line traced on your piece is going to help you get a really nice collar stand. So we want this dashed line traced onto the wrong side of our collar stand pieces. I'm going to align it onto the actual pattern piece. So I can put, here's the notch right here. And here is our piece. That's it. Just give yourself a nice clear line to follow. And you're gonna repeat that on both sides and both pieces. Also, I recommend taping this little piece to like your collar stand pattern piece so that you don't lose it, because it's really little, so it's definitely possible. We're marking our button and buttonhole placement on the right side of our collar stand. I'm going to do what I did before, which is to just mark one of them so that I can use the other as a reference. And I'm actually going to be doing purl snaps rather than buttons, so I won't need the button shape, just a little dot. Moving right along, we have this stitching line on our pocket D that we want to mark on the right side of our pocket. So I'm folding back at that line, aligning the pattern piece and tracing. Next up, we've got our cuff pieces. This is only if you're making the long sleeve version. So we're making this mark on the interfaced half of our cuff. So I'm just gonna fold it back so I can see it. Line up the pattern piece. This guy's marked. If you're making the long sleeve version, you're going to mark this slash mark on the wrong side of your sleeve. Folding my pattern piece back on that line, lining it up. The first few steps involve two tiny pieces: the locker loop and the neckerchief loop. So the locker loop is that little loop on the back yoke that's on some shirts, if you're not familiar with that term. The neckerchief loop is the loops that we add to the collar stand that hold the neckerchief in place. So if you are skipping the neckerchief, you don't need this, but these are done in the same way. So we're just gonna grab our iron and we are going to fold our piece in half lengthwise and give it a press. Then you will fold your edges in to meet that crease and give it another press. Carefully, because this is a small piece, so chances of getting the iron near your fingers are high and you don't want to get burnt. And then now you're just going to fold that in half, matching up those folded edges and giving it a press. And you have this tiny little guy. You're going to repeat that with this piece as well. Now you're going to take these to the machine and you're going to edge stitch 1/8 of an inch from this edge, sandwiching these two folded edges together, and you're just going to sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge going all the way down. You're going to do it with your locker loop and your neckerchief loops. When I'm sewing something little like this that I need to get close to one edge to, because we want to sew 1/8 of an inch from this folded edge, I will move the needle. Most machines have this where you can move the position of the needle. So that's my button, and I can move it all the way over so that it is positioned over here, and I can still run the narrow thing under my foot, but I don't have to be, you know, I don't have to have my piece pushed all the way over to the side, and it's harder to sew that way. Here's these pieces done, and if I may, just giving them a little clip to their respective pattern pieces will help you not lose them, because they are very little. Next up, we are going to sew the neckerchief, and may I call your attention to these two notches that are at the top of one side of your neckerchief. We are going to pin these together, right sides together. That's right sides together. And we're going to sew around this outer edge, but we're leaving the space between the two notches open. So starting here, going all the way around town, all the way up around the other side, and then stopping there. We're going to use our 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'll meet you back here after that. Here I have that sewn, and as you can see I left that opening. Now we're just going to trim the seam allowance down around the edge, and then we'll flip it right side out and press it. Okay, the way that I flip these things is you take something, a pen with its cap, nothing too sharp, and you can start to work the tip on there, and then you can push this through until it comes out the other side. Don't let the lid come off like what just happened with me, or you could get ink on your neckerchief. Okay. But you can pull this through. You can kind of squish that end out. We can also use a safety pin for this. So how we would do that is safety pin into the end, oops, just through one layer. And then push this back in. The challenging bit with the safety pin is that when we get to the other end, we're going to need to unfasten it and have it like fall out. But I think this is wide enough that I will be able to do just that. So I'm carefully ta-da! Okay, and then we're just going to do this, and then we're going to give it a good press. When you get to this little section with the ends that you left open, just fold them down as you press. Okay, now we are going to take this over to the sewing machine and edge stitch this little opening shut. If you want it to be invisible, you could hand stitch it, doing a ladder stitch right in here. But this is going to be hidden inside your collar and on your head when you wear it, so I'll just do it by edge stitching it on the machine. There's that finished. Now we're going to align our dart legs, and we're going to sew from here to the point. So I'm going to match them up with my pins. I'm going to start at the tip, or at the point, and I want my pins to be facing towards my side seam, because then I'll be able to remove them as I sew. So now I'll start sewing here at the beginning of this line, and I'm going to sew all the way to the point. Here I am sewing my dart, and I'm almost to the point. It's right here. And what I like to do when I sew my darts is I just keep sewing, get close to the edge, and then right after the point I catch a couple threads, and then I sew right off the edge a few times, and that twists your thread. And for me that's never come undone. I don't need to backstitch or anything. But yeah, that's just a tip I learned in fashion school. Here are my darts sewn, and then I pressed them downward. This next step involves our pocket. So I've got this wrong side facing up, and I'm going to press it under at these first notches, 3/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to fold them right sides together at the next set of notches. So there's another notch right here. I'm going to fold it, but not press it. And then I'll take this to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew 3/8 of an inch from this edge, just along this short edge on both sides. There's that sewn. Now we're going to flip it right side out. So you just have to give this corner a nice pinch right on that seam, and then push it. And if you fold it nicely into place, it'll just give you a nice square out the gate, and you don't have to do any sort of trimming or maneuvering. Now we are going to press these edges under 3/8 of an inch. So we've already kind of got that started for us, but I have a seam gauge here. Here's our pocket from the right side. Now we're going to sew 1/8 of an inch from this folded edge going across. Now we are going to pin our pocket to our front A, so we have that pocket placement. And I start by just aligning these corners, and then I like to do a little diagonal pin to hold that, and then making sure everything is flat as I pin towards that corner. Now we're going to stitch 1/8 of an inch from the edge going all the way around. We're top stitching, so this stitch should look nice. You're going to want to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch, and then you can also add bar tacks if you want for style or added strength. The next step is to add this stitching line right here. This is just like your little decorative, well, it is also useful, but this is your like little pocket dividing stitch. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to add the bar tacks to all 3 of these spots. And there is our finished pocket. To prep our center front placket, we are going to press this center front edge under 3/8 of an inch. Now we press it under again at the next notch, which is about 1 1/8 inch from that last fold. Now you're going to edge stitch down this edge 1/8 of an inch from this folded edge, and you'll repeat that on both sides. Here's that finished. I've got my front A's right side facing up, and I'm going to pin right sides together. I'm pinning my back yoke at the shoulders. Keep in mind that this is the yoke that will show on the outside of your shirt once it's sewn. So if you were doing a contrasting one on the inside, that would be your other one. You want to make sure this one's the one you want to see. Now we're going to sew this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance across each shoulder. We are going to pin our other back yoke. I've got the wrong side of our front facing up and the right side of our yoke facing down. So basically our back yokes are sandwiching our front pieces. And we're going to again stitch at the shoulders, but this time we'll use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here's that sewn. So I've got a little sandwich like this. We're just going to trim and grade these seams. When you have 3 layers of fabric, you can grade your seam, which is to cut each seam to a different seam allowance, so that when the shirt, so that there's less bulk in the seam once it's pressed away. It's not going to make a huge difference, especially with my fabric, it's kind of thin. So you're going to cut one down to a 1/4 inch and one down to 1/8 of an inch. I'm not doing that right now. That's what you would do if you have really bulky fabric. My fabric is thin. It's maybe like 4.5 ounces, and it's just not necessary. So I've cut down one, and then we have this, we're leaving this other seam at its full width so that those aren't sitting on top of each other, and it'll be less bulky. Now we are going to press our yokes up and away from our front. Here the yokes are pressed in place, and I'm just going to base them together, the two yokes together along this back neckline. That just makes it easier once we're adding the collar stand in the collar. There's that done. So you can see those are just at 1/4 of an inch basted together. So we're going to grab our back B and we're going to stitch it along this pleat stitching line. So if you keep it folded in half, you're just going to want to match up these, make sure your pleat lines are matched up on your front and back. So you're just going to stitch down to the bottom and back stitch. Here that is stitched, and you're going to open up your back, and you have a notch at center back that is going to fold down and match up with that seam, like so. And then we're going to baste across that top 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Here is our back with our pleat, and we're going to grab our locker loop. So we're just going to pin this locker loop in place. The raw edge of it butts up with the edge of the pleat, and then you kind of make like a little U here. And we're just going to give that a baste 1/4 of an inch from the edge. And there's that little cutie. Okay, so here is where the magic starts to happen. We've got our project laid out right side facing up, and we're going to be pinning our back to our back yoke, and we only want one layer in this one, so I'm pushing this other layer out of the way. And I just have my outer yoke sitting there, and then I'm going to right sides together place my back onto my back yoke, and we'll pin it in place. The back has a little bit of a curve to it to give you a tiny bit more room, and so you just need to work that into place, but it'll all fit together. You'll sew this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here is that sewn, and you're going to flip that away. So now we're looking at our back, our front, and we've got our yokes in the middle, and we have one loose yoke underneath here. So we'll just roll. The neater you do this, the easier it's going to be. If you just roll this really nicely into a little tube until it sits on top of your yoke. Now you're going to do the same thing with your front pieces, so just roll them nicely. This is the burrito method, and it's a very special method for sewing a yoke and enclosing all of the seams without having to do any like folding and top stitching. So those are sitting on that one back yoke. I've got my other back yoke here, and that just folds over and matches up so that it's right sides together with our other back yoke. And I'm just pinning that in place. You can kind of scooch any fabric that's under there that's not yoke or what you want in your seam. Just kind of give it a little lift and shake, and it'll fall away from where. Okay, now we sew this one using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. There we have our little burrito, and it's time to turn it right side out. So if you just grab one of your fronts, those are pretty easy to pull out, and then yeah, just flip this right side out, and you will have a beautifully finished shoulder and back seam, fully enclosed. And you want to go give this a good press. You have the option here to top stitch along here and along here if you would like to have more visible top stitching on your shirt. So now we are working on the collar, and we're just going to grab our collar pieces and we're going to pin them right sides together. And we'll sew around these three outer edges, 3/8 of an inch from the edge. And then we're going to clip the corners, and we will flip it right side out and give it a good press. Here is that collar sewn, and I've got it flipped right side out and pressed. You want to baste this lower edge together 1/4 of an inch from the edge. You also have the option to top stitch around the outer edge of your collar. So if you want to do that, you could baste and then just continue sewing. So going all around all 4 edges of your collar. Here's that sewn. Now we're going to trim our neckerchief loop into 3 pieces. So you need 3 2-inch long pieces. Here I have my interfaced collar stand, and I'm pinning my neckerchief loops in place on there. So you have these 3 marks. It's a center, and then for your sides there's a mark of where it is. And so you're just going to, those are notches, so I've got it right here, right here, and right here. And I'm just gonna pin those in place. And you're gonna sew an 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch from the edge on all of these 3 to secure them in place. And there they are sewn. Okay, now it's time to attach the collar stand to the body of the top, and we are using a method that I think is a little bit easier, but it may be different from what you've done in the past if you have done a collar stand before. So I traced the line on here a little bit darker to make sure I could see it. And this is going to be pinned, this is my interfaced collar stand, and I'm pinning it right sides together to the neckline of my top. So we'll start with just the one, and I'm matching the center notch. The notch where also you have one of your neckerchief loops matches up with the shoulder seam. And then your collar stand is a little bit longer. Your collar stand is a little bit longer than your front. So the end of your front matches up with this notch on your collar stand. And you want to be precise with that. And that'll be the case on the other side as well. You're going to sew starting at this notch and ending at this notch. You're not sewing all the way to the end. You're going to sew 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Here we have that sewn, and now I've got my shirt with the wrong side facing up. That front collar stand is basted in place. And now I am essentially doing the same thing with the other collar stand. It also has that notch that matches up, and we're just sandwiching our shirt in the middle here. Okay, now we're going to sew this using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now I have a collar stand, well, I guess it's a shirt sandwich with collar stand bread. So the collar stands are on either side of the body of the shirt, and now this is where it gets interesting. So we'll fold, I'm folding the shirt out of the way in here so that it doesn't get caught in this seam. And then we're matching up our collar stands. There's a notch up here that you'll want to be aware of that is going to match up. In this next step, you're just sewing along the stitching line, joining these 2 together, starting at the end of your last stitch and then ending at the notch. You'll repeat that on both sides, and you just want to kind of make sure that you're not sewing the front of your shirt in this step. Here's those little edges sewn, and now we're going to trim down the seam allowance, and then you're going to pull this right side out. We have a nice curved collar stand, and I still need to give this a good press and like work these seams out, but that's, you know, the gist of it. You'll repeat that on both sides. I forgot to mention also that we are going to clip into this seam allowance going around the curved edge of this seam so that it can lay really nicely. You'll just clip right up to the seam without clipping through it, and you can clip every 1.5 to 2 inches. And then we'll press the collar stands up away from the body of the shirt. Here's our collar stand all sewn up. Okay, next up we've got our collar that we are going to be sewing in. This will be first sewn to one layer of our collar stand. So we're sewing it to the interfaced layer only. So just kind of tuck that out of the way. You can start by matching up the notch. Oh, and also the interface side of your collar is going to be facing up. So right now you've got your shirt facing right side up and you've got your collar facing right side up. So I'm matching up the notch at center back and pinning this to just the one layer of the collar stand. The end of your collar matches up with this notch on your collar stand. And again, we're just sewing through one layer of our collar stand in this. Once you have those points matched up, you can add a couple more clips or pins in the middle to give you more reference points. And then you'll sew this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, going through just the collar and one layer of collar stand. Now we're going to join the lower collar stand to the collar. So just flipping this around so that I've got this unattached collar stand facing up. I'm gonna give the collar a press so that this seam underneath is sitting flat. I know there's no funny business there. Okay, now this raw edge is going to be pressed under 3/8 of an inch, and then it's going to be matched up, sitting just over. So we're pressing it under, and then it's sitting just over that seam, and we're gonna pin it in place, and then we're gonna stitch in the ditch to get this sewn together. Okay, so I pressed it, now I'm gonna pin it. Now you're going to stitch in the ditch, so that would be just 1/8 of an inch from the edge, or if you wanted to sew from this side, you would sew literally in the ditch. You will stitch 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge, and if you want, you can sew all the way around your collar stand. Okay, so there's that sewn, and you can see it on this side too. And yay! Now we're moving on to the sleeves. The next few steps will only be applicable if you're making a long sleeve version. You can skip ahead to where we're attaching the sleeve to the body. That's where the instructions converge again. These are my sleeve placket J pieces, and what we're going to do is press the long edges under 1/4 of an inch on both of them. Here I have one of my sleeve pieces, and we are going to be, if you'll remember, we marked a slash line for our placket. So we're going to cut that. Just carefully cut up to the top of your placket slash line. We're going to open it like this, and you'll grab one of your plackets. Here's my placket. The placket gets sewn right sides together to the opening. So how that works, so I'm unfolding the sleeve placket, but I still have that crease, and then I'm aligning this slash mark with the with that opening. When you get to the peak of your slash point, you are actually going to need to have it's only going to just barely overlap that crease by like a couple threads. You just want to catch it, but if you sewed it at 1/4 of an inch, you'd get like puckers. You'll go back down the other side. And it's okay if your placket's a little bit long. It's cut on the bias, so it can stretch. We're going to sew this, and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch from the edge, starting here, and we're following the crease that's on our placket. So we're following the crease, and as we get closer to the center, we just need to be really careful to not catch any puckers right here, and we're just barely catching a couple threads at the point. So when I'm sewing this, I'm following, the seam allowance is following at 1/4 inch, is following the edge of the placket, not the shirt, because it does scooch in as we get closer to the point. So when we get to the point, You can see there's all kinds of fabric here, and we just don't want to catch any puckers in this stitch. So I'm coming in really slow. Cool. And then when we get to the point, we only caught like a couple threads, and when this placket is flat, now I'm gonna flip the facing around. You want to make sure your seam allowance is going in, getting tucked into this. Okay, so now we can sew this 1/8 of an inch from the edge, just kind of holding that folded edge in place. And there she is. So now, this is the wrong side of the sleeve, and I'm just going to pinch this in half, and then you just sew a little diagonal line right here. Sew a little diagonal line right here and backstitch. That'll just hold the placket in place. There's that little diagonal seam. I'm gonna go ahead and just trim away this excess placket. The placket is going to go this way towards the body of the sleeve. You've got a little notch right here to help you out. So this one that is closer to the notch, just press it down, and we're just going to give that a little stitch 1/4 of an inch from the edge. You don't have to worry about that side. Here's our beautiful placket. Now we're going to join the sleeves to the body of our top, and we will be pinning them right sides together. So I've got my top sitting here, right side facing up, and then you will pin your sleeve in right sides together. And the way that you know that your sleeve is facing the right way is that there's a double notch on the back that matches up with the back, and a single notch on the front that matches up with the front. So let's start by matching this notch at the top of our sleeve with the shoulder seam. And then we'll move on, matching these single notches. Back here, we're gonna match the double notch. And then we're going to take this to the machine, and we're going to sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance going all the way around. And then we're going to finish the seam, which this is the first seam we've had to finish, so we'll go over that after this. Here we have that step done. So as you can see, I've joined the sleeve, and then I finished this seam using my serger. And you can finish your seam using a zigzag stitch right on the end. You could serge it, you could encase it in like a bias binding. We have a separate video all about seam finishes that I can link down below. So, and then I pressed the seam toward the body of the shirt. The next step is optional, but it looks kind of nice. So if you want, now that your seam is finished and pressed, from the right side, you can top stitch 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch from this seam going across the shoulders. That's just going to give a little bit of extra stability right there, and it's kind of a classic button-up shirt top stitching detail. So I'm going to do that, and I'll repeat it on both sides. Okay, here we have that done. Our next step is to flip our shirt inside out so that right sides are together. We're matching up the side seams of the front and the back, as well as the underarm seam of the sleeve. I'm the worst about trimming threads. That is my very bad sewing habit, is that I never do it. Okay, so we're gonna sew this whole seam in one go, and there's a couple matching points, so we wanna make sure that our underarm seam is matched up, that our side seam is matched up, and that our sleeve hems match up. After I have those few anchor points, I like to just go in and add a few more pins or clips for good measure. Okay, so we're going to sew this using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We'll start down here. You can sew all the way down. When you get here, you're just going to pivot onto your side seam and then sew all the way down to the hem. And then we will finish this seam the same way that we finished this seam. Here we go. So I've got that done, and then I pressed the seam towards the back body. For this next step, we're looking at our sleeve hem. So here's our placket, here is our underarm seam, and then there is one notch right here on our sleeve hem. We're going to take this to the machine and we're going to sew from the notch to the underarm seam, so not on the part where there's a placket, notch to underarm seam, we're adding gathering stitches. So gathering stitches are long straight stitches. You want to lengthen your stitch length to about like 5.5 to 6 millimeters long, and you'll sew one row 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and then you're going to sew another row 1/4 of an inch from that row, so it'll be a 1/2 inch from the edge. I'll do that and then I'll bring it back and show you. Here's that sewn, so you can see my stitch ends at my underarm seam and starts at my notch. So I'm going to set the shirt aside and we're going to prep the cuff and then we'll put them together. Here is our sleeve cuff, and we have the 1/2 that's interfaced and the 1/2 that's not. So we are going to pre-press one of the edges under, so we'll press this long uninterfaced edge under 3/8 of an inch. Ta-da! Next up, we are folding our cuff in half, and we have notches right here that are the halfway point, and we're going to fold it in half. You'll notice that your folded edge makes it so that you're not matching up these two edges. So we're going to fold it in half at those notches, and we're going to preserve this pressed edge, this pressed under edge. So we don't want to actually press this because we're just sewing it, but we're turning at that center notch right here, and then we're going to sew up these short sides of our cuff. Using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, we'll sew down each of these short sides. Here's that cuff sewn. So now we're going to flip it right side out, and you can just pinch this corner really nicely and then push it through neatly, and you should get a pretty crisp corner. And then we'll give this a press, still preserving that folded under edge. There we go. And you're going to repeat that with both cuffs. Now we're joining our cuff to our sleeve. So we will pin first this unpressed edge to the sleeve, right sides together. So this is the right side, this interface side of our cuff is the right side. And we are matching up this end with the end of our placket. And you want to just match those up really nicely. The next step is that there is a notch on our cuff that matches up with a notch on our sleeve. And then the next one I'm going to do is actually to fold the sleeve around, or the cuff around the sleeve, and match up this other end with the other end of our placket and clip that in place. Now we can see that our sleeve is bigger than our cuff and we need to gather it in. So I'm just going to pull gently on these to pull the gathers in on our sleeve hem until it is the same length as our cuff. Add that. And then I'm just going to, I have these gathers here, and I'm just going to move them around a little bit with my fingers to get them distributed evenly. You don't want any like big groupings, but this isn't going to be this doesn't have to be super precise. You just want to get that kind of nicely placed. And I'll add a couple more clips for good measure. Great. So in this step, we're going to be sewing 3/8 of an inch from the edge. We're going to sew from one end of our sleeve hem to the other, and we're just catching one layer of our cuff in this one. This is still going to be loose. So yeah, you'll just start here, and then sew to there. Okay, so here's that step done, and then I've also pressed my seam allowance downward so that it sits inside of the cuff. And then I'm taking this pre-pressed edge and I am folding it over the seam allowance, and then I'm going to make it so that this folded edge just overlaps that seam, and then I'm pinning it in place. And there's some extra, there's some visible gathering stitches here that you'll see from the outside, and you're just going to want to remove those. It's a short enough one that sometimes you can just pull it out, but be careful. So now we're going to edge stitch this in place. So you'll sew 1/8 of an inch from this folded edge all the way across. If you want, you can sew all the way around your cuff to give it top stitching all the way around. So it would be like dee 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 dee, and then pivot, come down, come across, come up, and then you have like a fully top stitched cuff. And here is our finished cuff. Okay, so now all we have left to do is the hem, and then we're going to add the closures. We're doing our hem will be turned under 1/4 of an inch twice. So I think it's easiest to start with a stitching guide, a stitched guide that will help us neatly press under 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch from the hem all the way down, just 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and I'll use a long straight stitch, probably about like 3.5 millimeters, not meters, long. Okay, so here I have that stitching line, and now I'm just going to press under 1/4 of an inch going all the way down my hem. And I am realizing that it is easier for me to travel this way because I am left-handed. I'm using that line of stitches that we made in that last step as a guide to get this pressed under perfectly at 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so now I will press it under another 1/4 of an inch. And if you want to add little clips as you go with this second round of pressing, that's sometimes helpful. Now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch from this folded edge going all the way down the hem. You can backstitch at the beginning and the end of the stitch as well. And here is our finished hem. Okay, so at this point you will follow your sewing machine's instructions to add buttonholes if you're adding buttonholes or snaps. I'm going to do purl snaps on this version. So they're kind of that like Western looking snap with a fake pearl in there. I'm going to install one on camera following the instructions so that you can kind of see how that would look. But yeah, I just recommend whatever method you're using, follow the instructions for that method. So I have my little mark from the beginning. I don't know if you can see it, but it's right there for the snap placement. And when you're doing your cuff, make sure you are like, okay, yes, this one is the top. So there's prongs on here that I push through, and you kind of have to work those through. So we can see our prongs, and then we grab our other component. So with this piece that joins to the purl, this side that has more of like a ditch that goes into it, that's the side that the prongs go down into. These purl snaps that I got are made from plastic, so I'm not super worried about hitting them directly with the mallet because they're pretty strong. They used to be made out of glass, and I think those ones I have cracked in the past by hitting them with a hammer. I have like a rubber mallet, not a hard hammer, so that helps. I find it helpful to give it like a forceful and concise smack, and then you can do a couple more, and that should get it in there pretty nicely. And then you can kind of, if you want, but again, be careful not to break this, but I'm pretty sure that's plastic. Other side, and I'm just going to kind of line these up to see exactly where I want it, and see, and now I'll be able to see that hole, and I know that the prongs go around that, so work the prongs through. And this sits on top. This is the one, I'm pretty sure they just want you to use a thread, because this little hole on the top of your thread can go over that little nipple. Yeah, there we go. That looks nice. And that's it. Our shirt is finished. I wanted to give you just a quick overview of how you put the neckerchief into the collar stand loops. It just is super easy, goes through like that, and then it holds it in place. And here is it on. I really love how this can be open or closed, and then there are so many options when it comes to the neckerchief. Like, you could leave it hanging. I think it looks kind of cute just open like that, and put it in your hair, tie it up, tie it around your neck. Anyway, the possibilities are endless, and I hope you enjoyed this sew along and that you have a great day. And yeah, see you next time.